Welcome back. In this video I will show you how to develop a methodology for a consulting projects. Now the principle can be used for any problem. At the moment we are working on a project that tries to link sharing of data in healthcare to economic growth in ASEAN countries. This project is a joint project with Gazi, Uddin and Aravinda Guntupalli. What this video will deliver is the following. I show you how to move from a problem statement to a methodology that can be applied to any problem you might face in consulting. So basically it's all about problem solving, how to develop a methodology that addresses your particular need. Now to get started we needed a picture for our title page. We didn't want to spend any money, so we did ask our unpaid intern to pose for it. So here you are. So now we have a nice context of e-healthcare and its impact on economic growth. Let's get into it. So first it's important to understand the main objective, how enhanced data sharing of health related information generates economic growth. So the main challenge is we need to develop a methodology that links data sharing in healthcare to economic growth. Then we have to find data to test this relationship. And of course all of that needs to be seen in the context of country-specific factors that, for instance, drive regulations and policies, because they do matter, in particular in the context of sharing data. So how to develop a methodology? Now usually when you are taught by academics, they always tell you first to develop a theory, go out there, get the data and test your theory. Obviously that doesn't work in practice. It absolutely doesn't work, except you have years of time to do that. So what I tend to use all the time is what you might call backward engineering. So what we do is we look at, okay, what data do I have? Looking at the data I have, what can I actually do? So from the data I actually develop the methodology, not other way around. In terms of the data which are easily available, it's usually a good starting point to obtain macroeconomic data, so data on the country level. And there are plenty of data sources available. We use a conference board total economy database and the World Development Indicators. Both are available for free, and I have links down below in the description. The main issue and the main challenge you face is there is no data on data. So you won't get anything that you can measure on data sharing. Yeah? So we have to try to come up with alternative data sources. Now once you exhausted macro level data, the next step is to go to firm level and industry level data. For the industry level you can usually use industry reports, and there are quite a few covering e-health in this particular area, published by various consulting firms including McKinsey. Now other sources can be used on the firm level, including reports, so financial statements published by companies. To get access to that you might need to use Python to do some web scraping, or to use Python to collect data from PDF files, because most of these reports will be in PDF format. I have done actually a video on how to obtain data from PDF files and how to use it then for your data analysis. Then you might obtain financial statements from data sources including Bloomberg and DataStream, but this has its limitations. So once you go into micro businesses, startup companies, you will struggle getting any data from them. Yeah? So you might need to rely on other forms of data collection. And then of course you can exploit APIs to link into social media platforms. They can be useful to understand, for instance, the barriers of data sharing. Yeah? So do people trust policies? Yeah? So and that's important in particular if you think about developing policies in this area. Good, so what I always do next is I now start painting a little picture. So the first thing I do is I try to relate the different elements of my problem, using a figure, and this figure will help me to develop an understanding of interrelationships, which I then might call a methodology. I start here with my data sharing, and the objective is to link data sharing to somewhere living over here. That would be GDP growth. Now there is no really obvious way to link the two, because literally you don't get the data on data sharing. So that's not straightforward to do. In terms of data, I have macroeconomic data. So the macro data I obtain from various data sources. They in particular refer to GDP. So GDP I can, of course, obviously measure, no problem whatsoever. There are other elements which I can measure. In particular, what I can measure is the ICT capital. ICT capital is referring to the infrastructure I need for data sharing. So this includes things like networks, so broadband networks and so on. So this is information technology, communication, all put together into one category. That I can measure. In terms of methodology, I can also relate this ICT capital to GDP. So that is possible, and that goes through productivity basically. And this is delivered in terms of methodology by growth accounting. So this in terms of methodology here, that basically refers to growth accounting. The next thing I do then is I try to understand requirements. So what do you need in order to do the data sharing? So the most obvious argument is to argue, well, I need ICT to do data sharing. So this is basically absolutely essential. So I need ICT infrastructure to do the data sharing. Then of course the next question I ask is how does data sharing actually, where does it work? Who is actually the player here? So who is acting in this case? And of course the obvious thing to think about this is that data sharing actually sits inside an industry, inside companies. So here we talk about what you call e-health or digital health. So there are various companies that provide digital healthcare, and they need data sharing. Again, there is a requirement here. So this is absolutely required. In terms of data, again, we would get here micro level data. So firm level data, and they will help us to understand this interrelationship between e-health providers and data sharing. The other thing, of course, which then matters is, from a data perspective, is the industry perspective. The industry perspective will in particular help us to obtain a measure that links e-health to healthcare. Because in most other country level databases we won't have this information. And there are various reports, and we already figured this out, that relates these two, and the estimate is that somewhere between 2 and 5% of healthcare refers at the moment to e-health, and we have forecasts for its growth going forward. Good, so now we have the main relationships, and that of course again I can refer back to GDP, because I know the extent of healthcare, so that is obtained again from macro data. So that part here is again, that's macro data, so we have information on that, and other data sources will help us to relate e-health to healthcare, and healthcare to GDP is easy to link. Good, so basically then we have a link between e-health, healthcare, and then to GDP. And finally, the last bit is to relate, of course, this in the context of the country level. Yeah, so in particular, here, this whole area that is embedded in the country level. So here we have to talk about policy, we have to talk about regulation, because that, of course, affects the way we share data. So this is the country-specific effect. And of course, again, for that we have policy-related data sources. Now that is the principle how we could link these different elements. Of course, that's an initial study, so we have a few initial findings which I want to briefly present. First of all, when you look at world development indicators, you can look at various indicators, and basically the picture is that in the case of ASEAN countries, you have a massive expansion of ICT related infrastructure. Now this is for mobile phone subscription. The other thing to note is that ASEAN countries since 1950 experienced significant catch-up growth. Finally, we can see that this is partly driven by a high share of ICT capital. And then what we have done using growth accounting is we tried then to link economic growth to ICT capital, other forms of capital and labor, and used then interaction terms to relate ASEAN countries to these different components of growth. And what we find is that all three capital components contribute to economic growth. However, in the case of ASEAN countries, the growth coming from ICT capital is much more pronounced compared to other countries. Now this is an interesting finding. It means that there is a higher sensitivity to ICT investment in ASEAN countries. So this is a good starting point, a good prerequisite to exploit this in the context of e-health. Now what are the next steps? Of course, we are not done yet. So what we do next is we try to understand the sensitivity of e-health, linking it to healthcare spending on GDP growth using a panel vector autoregression. Now this sounds very fancy, but actually what it does is it relates a whole set of variables to each other. Yeah, because end of the day, GDP growth drives healthcare spending and vice versa. Yeah, they are not independent. Yeah, they are all interrelated. So we have to understand the dynamics of this system. After estimating this model, we obtain dynamics in the form of so-called impulse response functions. They can be used in simulations to actually then predict the impact of more data sharing or a policy change on future economic growth. And finally, we have to talk about barriers, we have to talk about policies and recent advances in cybersecurity to overcome the issues with sharing data in healthcare. Thank you very much. I see you in the next video.